You begin to imagine the stillness that descends once the last of the daylight fades behind the thick grey clouds of a northern medieval sky. It is late in winter, and the sun slips away early, long before the castle's routines have ended, and much earlier than anyone would like. The chill has already crept through every unsealed crack in the stonework, even in the great hall, with its tall hearth and orange embers still glowing faintly. The air carries the kind of cold that never really leaves. You are surrounded by silence, but not the empty kind. This is the deep, muffled quiet of stone, of thick wool cloaks being drawn tighter, of boots softly thudding against old rushes that line the floor. The outer walls are almost 2 meters thick, meant to keep out arrows, not cold. The wind does not whistle here. It groans. It presses itself against the grey granite like a tired traveller with no place to sleep. If you were a guest here, if you somehow found yourself in a medieval keep in January, your first impression wouldn't be of the feasting or the banners, or the armour hanging neatly from wooden racks. It would be of dampness. Damp in the air, in the walls, in the wool of your sleeves, and in the straw tucked under your mattress. Even where fires burn, their heat is slow to move, and the stone always wins in the end. Candlelight does what it can, but candles were precious. They were made from tallow, rendered animal fat, unless you were rich enough to afford beeswax, which burned cleaner, without the greasy smoke. Most people weren't. In the poorer parts of the castle, if there were lights at all, they were, few and far between. And in the servants' quarters, there was mostly darkness, interrupted by the occasional flicker of a single rushlight, just a reed dipped in fat, smoking in its little clay holder. You imagine sitting on a wooden bench near the fire in the great hall. There are others here, men and women from the household talking softly, maybe mending garments, maybe just waiting for sleep. They don't talk loudly. Voices carry in stone spaces. Everything echoes. A laugh might linger longer than it should, so most people whisper. Outside, the guards walk slowly along the wall walk, cloaks drawn up to their ears. The torches they carry hiss and sputter in the wind. Their boots scrape along the frost-covered stone. They're watching for nothing in particular, just keeping the rhythm, one foot after the other, looking out into a world gone dark before the day even felt finished. In the kitchens, there is still warmth and a little light. The coals glow under the blackened iron cauldrons. Someone stirs a pot of pottage, even this late, not for guests, but for the kitchen hands themselves. A bit of barley, some onions, and turnip. Maybe a shred of salted meat, if someone was feeling generous. The smell is thick, earthy, like the walls themselves might one day absorb it. If you're thinking the castle is lively at night, you'd be mistaken. Medieval life moved with the sun. When darkness came, people slept. There were no midnight discussions, no candlelit readings. Most couldn't read, and candles were far too dear for such indulgences. So once the chores were done, and the embers, tucked in, people slipped away, to cots, to pallets, to narrow beds built into alcoves in the wall. The richer you were, the closer your chamber would be to the hearth. Lords and ladies had beds with curtains, not for privacy, but for warmth. The heavy hangings held in some heat and kept out the draughts. The sheets were linen, if you were lucky. Wool, if you weren't. The mattress? Straw, or sometimes hay. Lumpy, uneven, the smell of last year's harvest. Faint now, but still there. The Chronicles, those books the monks kept, filled with long lists of names and deeds and taxes paid, seldom mentioned the night. But once in a while, a monk would write a line about how winter came early, or how the North Tower was hard to keep dry. They wrote about the quiet, when the snow blanketed the yard and muffled even the sounds of the horses in the stables, about how the bell at Compline seemed louder in the dark, as though the stone itself carried the sound farther. There were other sounds too, mice scurrying, the creak of old wood, the low groan of the wind pressing against the arrow slits, and, always, the occasional cough from someone in a nearby room. echoing faintly through the corridors, quickly swallowed by the thickness of the walls. If you lay in one of those beds, wrapped in your cloak, perhaps sharing it with someone else, not out of affection but survival, you wouldn't sleep deeply. Not in winter. The fire never lasted long, the warmth never stayed, and the morning came slowly, with barely a sliver of light. Some castles had tapestries, not for art, but insulation. Woven cloth hung on stone walls helped trap warmth. The richer the lord, the larger the tapestry. Scenes of battles, of forests, of saints and angels. But no matter how grand, none of it mattered after dark. The colours disappeared. The cloth turned shadowy. The threads looked like vague outlines of dreams, faded and worn. No matter your status, nighttime in a medieval castle was a time for waiting. Waiting for morning. Waiting for the sun to return. Waiting for the cold to pass. And most of all, waiting without much to do. You couldn't go far. You couldn't see. And most of the people around you were just as cold, just as tired, just as still. You might lie awake, listening, to the flick of ash falling from a log, to the water in the wooden bucket freezing slowly beside the wall, to the breathing of someone across the room. All of it distant, hollow, and none of it quite enough to hold on to. But somewhere, in another part of the keep, a scribe might still be awake. Not writing, perhaps, but reading over his notes, a cold finger tracing faded ink. And maybe he'd write just one more line, in tiny, cramped Latin script, noting that the wind had not let up since sunset, that the fire had gone out an hour too early, that the night, like so many others that winter, was long and uneventful. But what exactly did they feel, those scribes and guards and servants and nobles, as they sat in silence under the weight of cold stone? What did the quiet say to them, when they had nothing else left to hear? There is a time just after the light fades, when the last tasks of the day are quietly finished. This is not the part of castle life that anyone recorded in poetry or song. It is not about battles or honour or feasts. It is about folding cloth napkins, gathering dry rushes from the floor, checking locks on doors that no one will use again until morning. These are the final motions before the long, uncertain stretch of night begins. You might imagine a young boy, perhaps a page, walking the length of the lower hall, stooping now and then to collect pieces of fallen bread or bones left behind from the evening meal. He carries a dull tin bowl in one hand, and his breath forms a pale fog with each exhale. No one speaks to him. He does not expect them to. His shoes are damp, his hands are raw, but he is not in pain. This is simply the way things are, the rhythm of service. Along the outer walls, shutters are fastened with wooden bars or thick leather straps, not for security necessarily, but to stop the icy drafts. Most windows are narrow, long vertical slits barely wide enough for an arm, but the cold still finds its way in. The shutters don't block much, and the stone beneath each sill is always damp to the touch. Someone checks each one before bed, dragging a stool across the flagstones to reach the higher latches. The torches in the corridor are dying now. There is no one to replace them. After Compline, the final prayer of the monastic day, most lights are left to fade. The halls are navigated in darkness or by memory. Only the guards are permitted to carry lamps, and only when they patrol. A fire left burning without supervision could ruin a castle. Fires are kept low, smothered early. It's safer that way. Cold is preferable to ashes. In one chamber, a woman is brushing wool, not spinning or sewing, just brushing, slowly, with a bundle of dried thistleheads wrapped in cloth. It is the last wool of the season. Her fingers move automatically. She brushes by candlelight, though the candle is nearly done. The smoke has turned her fingertips grey. She knows the weight of silence here. She has worked beside it, her whole life. In the stables, the air is warmer, not from fire, but from bodies. Horses stand still, their sides steaming gently in the colder air. A stable hand, likely a boy no older than 10, is shoveling straw, moving quietly, carefully. Not to disturb the animals, not to wake the knight, whose room is just above. Boy doesn't hate this task. He doesn't know there is any other kind of night. The animals in a castle feel the cold too. Chickens roost where they can, often just inside the kitchen doors. Cats curl into the corners, tails tucked tight. Dogs, the lean, sharp-nosed kind bred for hunting, are let inside only rarely. If they're lucky, they find a space near the hearth. If not, they curl near the stairs, out of the draught. There are no pets in the way you know them. These animals are working creatures, companions only by coincidence. The inner ward is dark now. It was never well lit, even by day, but at night it becomes another world entirely. Shapes change, shadows stretch. The gatehouse is closed, portcullis down, and near the small postern gate, a lesser entrance for servants and quiet arrivals, a single guard leans against the stone, arms crossed inside his cloak. He listens, not for danger, just for change, something to mark the passage of time. Inside the solar, the chamber used by the Lord's family, silence is almost complete. A fire smoulders, mostly coals now. A woman, perhaps the lady of the house, sits in a chair by the window, wrapped in 3 layers of wool and fur. She isn't reading, just listening. Her children are asleep, curled under heavy quilts. She listens to the wind, or the scratching of a branch against the window. She might pray. She might not. No one will record what she did. Her thoughts will leave no trace. Even the chapel, tucked between walls of heavy stone, feels cold. The priests have finished their evening rites. The incense has faded, but the smell lingers, sweet and strange, mixing with the scent of wax and old wood. The altar cloth has been folded back. The silver candlesticks have been placed in their chest. And the priest, now alone, leans on the bench in the back corner, eyes closed. Not sleeping, just waiting. All throughout the keep, people are waiting. For warmth, for sleep, for dawn. Some sleep easily, used to the rhythm, used to the dark. Others lie awake, eyes open beneath rough woolen blankets, watching the ceiling beams disappear into shadow. What the Chronicles do not say is how the night really felt. They don't describe the itch of straw against the skin, or the sound of a log splitting in the hearth, or the way a foot might slip from under a blanket and instantly freeze. They don't speak of the quiet fear, the one not of ghosts or raiders, but of getting up in the dark to relieve oneself in a freezing chamber, pot. Of the sudden stillness that came when a child coughed and didn't cough again. In one of the servants' rooms, a man wakes coughing. He rolls to his side, pulls his cloak tighter. There is no candle. He knows the room well enough not to need one. He stares at the wall, counting the stones in the seam above his bed. He counts them every night. There are always the same number, and, in the armory, tucked into the bottom of the south tower, the air is unmoving. Armor hangs silently. The padded gambesons, stiff with dried sweat and oil, line the walls. The smell is heavy, earthy, metallic. Nothing stirs here, though sometimes. People say the suits creak at night, but it's just wood settling, or rats. And if you were to walk the gallery between the upper chambers and the tower stairs, you would hear nothing but your own footsteps. The tapestries barely move. The air here is thick, unmoving, like the inside of a cave. You pass a door, left slightly open. The glow of a nearly spent candle lights a desk. Ink frozen in the well, a quill fallen sideways. No one is inside. You begin to realize the truth of these winter nights, that they were not filled with stories or mystery or romance, but with repetition. The same rituals, the same silences, the same long stretches of darkness. What changed were not the nights, but the people inside them. A new servant, a different scribe, a new child born into the cold. The castle stayed the same, and yet, if it all was so still, so unremarkable, why did some monks, some chroniclers, still take the time to mention it? A line here, a phrase there. The frost set in early. The fire did not last through matins. 3 hens froze. Why remember these things, unless they mattered more than they seemed? There is a moment in every medieval night when the castle seems to fall into a deeper silence. The chores are finished. The candles have guttered out. Even the guards grow quiet. Their pacing slower, less frequent. And in this deeper part of night, the coldest, quietest hours, thoughts begin to drift. Not spoken aloud, not written down, just the private meanderings of those who live behind stone. In the smallest sleeping quarters, where 2 or 3 servants might share a straw-filled mattress, someone shifts. Maybe from discomfort, or a dream. Maybe from the cold. The warmth of bodies helps, but only a little. The blankets are coarse. The air smells faintly of old tallow and the mustiness of dried herbs hung from wooden pegs. Lavender maybe, not for luxury, just to mask the smell of wet stone and unwashed clothes. You would not hear much here. A whisper, perhaps, between 2 bunkmates. But more often than not, silence. Not because there is nothing to say, but because voices feel too heavy for the hour. A sentence might stir too much of the mind, and no one wants that. These are hours meant to pass like mist. Not far away, in a chamber closer to the Lord's Hall, a clerk lies awake under 3 woolen blankets, staring at the beams above him. His writing hand is cramped from a week's worth of records, wheat tallies, parchment orders, salt allowances. He closes his eyes and recites the Abbey's prayer in his mind, not from devotion, but from habit. The Latin lines are worn into his memory like grooves in a stone step. He does not remember a time before this routine. Above him, in the solar, the lord of the castle breathes heavily. He sleeps, but not peacefully. His dreams are busy. He is not a cruel man, but he carries the burdens of a dozen disputes over land, over tithes, over sheep that do not belong to him. Tomorrow, there will be judgments to pass, decisions to make. Tonight, his brow furrows, even in sleep. His wife is awake beside him. She does not speak. She watches the coals in the fireplace fade. She listens for mice in the walls. She wonders how much salt is left in the larder, how long the barley will last before someone must go to market again. She knows the steward will handle it. Still, she wonders. In another chamber, a young girl sleeps with a doll tucked under one arm. The doll is made from scraps. A cloth face, no eyes, just a thread of stitching where a smile might be. Her dreams are lighter than the rest. She does not yet know to worry. In the chapel tower, where the bell rope hangs stiff in the frozen air, a monk sits alone. He is meant to wake for matins, the midnight prayer. But tonight he rose early, couldn't sleep. His joints ache from the cold, and his thoughts are louder than they should be. He remembers his brother, who died last winter. A fever, they said. He had tended him for 3 days before it took him. Now he rings the bell for no one but himself. Below him, in the crypts, it is always cold. The stone there is older, smoother. The air does not move. No one goes due. Down there at night, there is no need. The dead have no use for candles or company. Somewhere along the outer wall, a guard leans forward to peer out over the fields. It is too dark to see anything. But he looks anyway. The wind moves his cloak. His fingers ache inside his gloves. He yawns quietly. There will be 2 more rounds before he can rest. He does not fear an attack. No one comes in winter, not even thieves. And in the kitchens, someone has woken early. An older woman, bent and careful with her steps, adds a piece of kindling to the hearth. She doesn't light it, not yet, just prepares it. She checks the bread dough left near the coals, wrapped in cloth. It has risen a little. Not much. The kitchen always grows too cold at night. She sits for a moment, not out of laziness, but age. She closes her eyes, listens to the crack of the log as it shifts in the ashes. The rhythm of the night is familiar to her. She has lived through more winters than she can count. She does not need to be told what to do. You begin to understand. These nights were not empty, but full of quiet moments no one recorded, thoughts no one shared. A servant wondering if his sister survived the plague last year. A guard thinking of the sea he saw once, 10 years ago. A monk remembering his mother's voice. A kitchen maid silently counting the days until Lent. Chronicles, so detailed in their lists of coin and cattle, had no space for this. Their pages were filled with what could be measured. But how do you record the sound of someone breathing in a stone chamber, waiting for morning? How do you write down the feeling of a wooden floor still holding the day's warmth, just beneath a barefoot step? Most nights passed without change. But once in a while, something would break the rhythm. A wolf howling too close, a stranger knocking after dark, a candle falling, a baby born. When those things happened, someone would mention it. The child was delivered during the night. The wolf was driven off. A candle scorched the table linen. These moments appear like tiny stars in a long night of ink and silence. But for every star recorded, hundreds more passed unnoticed. So the question remains, not what happened on these winter nights in castles, but what was felt. What dreams shaped the people who lived there? What memories did they carry, hidden in the folds of their blankets and the cold corners of their rooms? And if you had lived among them, beneath those heavy beams and thick walls, with only the wind and your breath for company, what would you have thought about in the middle of a winter night? You might think the night in a medieval castle was silent. And to an outsider, perhaps it was. But to those who lived within those thick stone walls, the dark hours were filled with quiet, specific sounds. Each one familiar, each one holding its own place in the rhythm of the night. The most constant was the sound of the wind, not just a single gust, but the many ways it moved through the structure. It slipped through cracks in shutters, rattled iron hinges, and moaned softly beneath the eaves like someone whispering through cupped hands. In the towers, it created an eerie, flute-like hum, a sound that never quite settled, always shifting. It was not frightening, only ever-present, like an old house shifting in its sleep. There was also the groan of wood. Castle beams, though massive and seasoned, still flexed with temperature. In the deep night, the cold contracted everything. A sudden knock from the roof might echo through 3 rooms, loud enough to startle a sleeping page. Sometimes, floorboards gave a creak, even when no one stepped on them. The castle itself seemed to breathe. In the kitchens, water in pails might pop as it began to freeze. Bread crusts hardened and cracked slightly as the air cooled. Occasionally, a mouse, ever bold in winter, would scurry across the pantry floor, rustling crumbs, tipping a spoon. These were not disruptive sounds, just pieces of the nightly pattern, each one mapped onto a place, a routine. The people living there knew them well. A change in tone, a louder creak, a distant clang, meant something was out of place. That awareness became a skill, the ability to hear the unusual hidden within, the ordinary. And then there were the smells. Unlike the faint modern air of sealed buildings and filtered rooms, a medieval castle's scent was its own living presence. It did not leave with the people. It clung to the walls, to the tapestries, to the clothing. There was the smoke, of course. Not the clean, bright smell of wood smoke, but something thicker. Fires were rarely tended with care overnight. Wood was damp or old. Sometimes peat was used. The result was a rich, heavy scent, earthy and sour. You would smell it in your hair, in your sleeves, even in your blankets. There were herbs too, tucked into corners, pressed into straw mattresses, tied in bundles from ceiling hooks, sage to purify, lavender to calm, rosemary to mask rot. Their smells mingled with the wood smoke, a kind of rustic perfume, not sweet, but grounding, necessary. Then there was tallow, Almost all candles were made from animal fat. When they burned, they filled the air with a greasy, slightly sour smell. It clung low in the rooms, especially those with poor airflow. Some nights a person would wake not from sound, but from the sharp scent of a wick that had sputtered out and smoked in the dark. Even the stone had a smell, especially in winter. Cold, damp, slightly mineral, a kind of blankness. You might notice it most when entering a stairwell or opening a chest that hadn't been used in weeks. In the stables, the scent of straw and manure mixed with wet leather, iron, and hay. It was strong, yes, but not unpleasant to those used to it. It meant life, warmth, animals, breath. The stink of the pens was far preferable to the cold emptiness of unused buildings. And of course, there were human smells, unwashed bodies, wool damp from breath, old shoes, mended tunics, and sweat that never fully left a garment. No one spoke of it. It was not offensive, just reality. Everyone carried the same layers. It was a closeness that bound people together, servant and lord alike. But what people remembered, more than sound or scent, were the shadows. There were many of them, the flickering kind made by a low fire on uneven walls, the steady ones carved by candlelight across rush-covered floors, the deep ones in corners, under beds, behind doors left ajar. Shadows moved even when no one walked. They were shaped not just by flame, but by fear, memory, imagination. Children were taught not to fear them. Yet still, in quiet moments, even grown men might find themselves staring into the darker parts of a hallway, half waiting for a shape to move. These were not ghosts, necessarily, just uncertainties, a reminder that in the medieval world, darkness was never quite empty. In some castles, wall paintings faded into those shadows, saints half visible behind soot, hunting scenes worn away by candle smoke and time. At night, those images seemed to breathe. A painted hound's eyes might catch the firelight just enough to shimmer. A haloed monk might seem to lean forward as the wick guttered. Tapestries added to this feeling. Woven in dark reds and greens, they sagged and fluttered with draughts. They muffled sound, yes, but they also made the room feel less stable. The walls moved slightly, the edges of vision blurred. To live in such a place, to sleep there night after night, required a kind of quiet endurance. Not bravery exactly, just a calm submission to the unknown. People did not try to banish the shadows. They let them exist, side by side with the light. Some chroniclers hinted at this in indirect ways. A monk might write, "The shadows lengthened in the south transept," or "the candles hissed against the damp." Rarely more. These were not events worth recording, just part of the daily texture, but they mattered. The sounds and smells and shifting shadows shaped how people thought, how they prayed, how they dreamed. They changed what seemed real. A child, growing up in that environment, would imagine different things than a child of light and glass. They would know fear, yes, but also patience. They would recognize the creak of their mother's tread, the scent of stew cooked too long, the feel of a woolen sleeve stiff with frost. These small things became anchors in the darkness, and as the hours passed, as the coals died and the wind slowed, sleep would finally take most of them. The castle, not fully silent but close to it, seemed to exhale. Only a few remained awake. The final patrol, the sleepless priest, a mother with a fussy child, and even they, if not lulled by warmth, were calmed by routine. The night was not feared. It was simply endured. But what did they dream of, those who finally drifted off? Was it warmth, summer fields, or simply a morning when the fire would light easily and the bread would rise without cracking? And if you had to live that same night, every winter for years, what small details would become sacred to you? Winter in a medieval castle didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, with shortening days, cooler winds, and changes that weren't always obvious until they were everywhere. But for those who lived behind the walls, the season never came as a surprise. Winter was expected, feared a little perhaps, but mostly respected. Everyone knew it was coming. The real work happened, long before the snow. Summer and autumn were not times of rest. They were months of gathering, drying, salting, spinning, building, repairing. There was a rhythm to it, as natural and ancient as the swing of the sun across the sky. In the gardens, women bent over rows of leeks, onions and herbs, pulling what they could before the first frost ruined it. What could not be eaten fresh was strung up to dry. Sage, thyme, dill, and parsley hung in bundles from beams. The scent of crushed leaves clung to fingers, mingled with the earth. Grains were stored in bins and sacks, placed carefully where mice would not find them. Barley was a staple, used for porridge, beer, and bread. Oats, too, were valued. Wheat was rare in smaller castles, often reserved for the nobility's finer loaves. Every kernel mattered. Even one spoiled sack could make the difference between hunger and stability. In the cellars, the last of the summer's ale was bottled in thick ceramic jugs, sealed with wax or linen. Vinegar was left to ferment. Salted meat, pork mostly, sometimes fish, was packed into barrels. It was not a luxury, only a necessity. Meat would grow tough and dry through the months, but it kept people alive. The smokehouse ran for days in October, filling the air with a dense, oily scent. Ribs, hocks, sausages, all hung in orderly rows, tended with an obsessive care. Too much smoke and the meat was bitter, too little and rot would set in. The balance was delicate and critical. Wool, freshly sheared in late spring, had long since been spun and dyed. By autumn, the weaving was underway. Every household in the castle, from the laundress to the steward, set aside a portion of cloth for winter wear. Cloaks were patched, mittens stitched. If a hole went unnoticed in October, it would be felt in January. In the courtyard, firewood was stacked high against the stone. Children were sometimes sent to gather kindling from the woods, dragging bundles of twigs in baskets on their backs. Larger logs were cut and split by the castle's men, their axes echoing down the hills. It was grueling work, but it had a kind of rhythm, like breathing. Split, stack, carry, repeat. Ash from previous winters was sifted and saved. It had many uses: cleaning, tempering lye, insulating cold corners. Nothing went to waste. Not ash, not bones, not even the frayed ends of rope. Everything had a second life. In winter, frugality wasn't virtue, it was instinct. The castle's windows were another concern. Most were narrow slits, called arrow loops, designed for defense, not comfort. In wealthier castles, oiled parchment or horn might cover the openings to reduce the draft, but in most, open air slipped in easily. Tapestries helped. So did shutters, thick with iron hinges and wrapped in straw-stuffed cloth. Chimneys were cleaned before the cold set in. So were hearths and ovens. A blocked flue could choke a room with smoke or start a fire no one could stop. These were dangers no one romanticized. The same hearth that offered warmth could just as easily offer death. The livestock pens were sealed, more tightly. Chickens and goats were brought into outbuildings, close enough to feed and protect, far enough not to overwhelm with smell. Their body heat helped keep the sheds warm, and their sounds, though loud at first, faded into the nightly rhythm. The Lord's steward kept a running tally of food stores, candle supplies, wool stock, salt, oil, and ale. His notes, scratched in charcoal or ink, read more like prayers than plans. There was always fear something would run out, that a trade would fail, that too many visitors would come, or a road would be blocked by snow. The priest, if the castle had one, gave sermons about endurance and providence. Winter, he might say, was sent to teach patience, to humble the body, to remember the soul, but even he would count his candles carefully. and lay out his heavier robes near the fire. Children watched all this preparation with wide eyes, not fully understanding its urgency. They were given tasks, gathering wool, shelling beans, helping the cook. But the true weight of the season hadn't yet settled on their shoulders. They still found wonder in the first frost, excitement in the snow. And still, despite all this effort, not everything could be controlled. There would be illness. The cold, damp air bred coughs that turned deep. Food spoiled. Oil ran low. Accidents happened. Fires sparked. Animals died. Boots tore. People slipped. Sometimes they did not get back up. And so, each year, before the first true cold arrived, there was a quiet understanding between everyone. We do what we can. The rest is not up to us. This mood, this atmosphere of readiness and resignation, was rarely recorded in the Chronicles. The scribes wrote about how many sacks of flour were stored, how many geese slaughtered, how many logs laid out by the wall, but they did not write about the steward's unease, the nursemaid's worn hands, the old man sharpening a blade not for war, but to butcher a frozen sheep. They did not write about the whispered conversations in the kitchens. Will it be a short winter? Do you think we'll have enough barley? Did the goats look thinner this year? They did not write about the quiet moment a young woman sat with her hands wrapped around a cup of broth, staring into the fire, and whispered, not to anyone in particular, please, let this be an easy season. And yet these were the details that shaped survival. These were the moments that bound castle life together. Not war, not feasts, but the slow, patient preparation for cold and dark. If you lived there, if you worked in the kitchens, or helped the steward, or mended the cloaks, what would you have feared most? Not death, perhaps, but scarcity. The creeping realization that something might run out too soon, that the fire might not light, that the last candle might gutter before morning. Would you have found comfort in the rhythm of tasks, or dread in the knowledge that winter always came, whether or not you were ready? When darkness arrived in a medieval castle, it did so completely. The sun fell behind the hills or forest, and the world slipped into blue and black. Fires were lit earlier, candles trimmed with small knives. But light was precious. It was not used idly. So, people adapted. They moved slower. They gathered in tighter spaces. They spoke in lower voices, not out of fear, but out of practicality. The castle became hushed. Not silent, never silent, but muted. Evenings after supper were not long. There was no electricity, no glowing hearths that lasted into the night unless carefully fed. Once the evening meal was done, and it was usually plain, a pottage or porridge, people settled into the tasks that didn't require much light or movement. Women might mend clothing, the hem of a tunic, a tear in a blanket. The thread was coarse, and the needle thick, but the movements were practiced. Fingers worked by memory more than sight. In noble households, embroidery might continue, but even that was limited by the flicker of tallow candles. Men sometimes sharpened tools by the fire, not in a rush, but in a kind of meditative rhythm. A whetstone passed slowly over a blade. Shh, shh. A soft repetition that added to the texture of the room. Children played quietly with carved toys, or simply lay under blankets listening to the adults. Their games were short, their laughter brief, joyous, but contained. They knew bedtime. Came early, especially in winter. Occasionally someone would tell a story, not a dramatic tale, not of knights or saints. Those were for feast days. The nightly stories were simpler, local memories mostly. A story about when the cows escaped during a snowstorm, or the time someone dropped a lantern in the snow and it hissed like a snake. These stories were not meant to thrill just to fill time. They were soft-spoken and passed like steam, warm and then gone. In wealthier castles, there might be a reader, a cleric or monk, who would recite from a manuscript. Psalms were common, chronicles sometimes. But reading was work, and precious books were not left near the hearth. Most nights, there was simply talk. As the fire sank lower, people drifted to sleep. But sleep did not come all at once, nor last, in a single stretch. In medieval Europe, it often came in two distinct phases, what some historians call first sleep and second sleep. After sundown, people would sleep for a few hours. Then, they would wake, naturally, often around midnight or slightly after. This interval could last an hour or more. During that time, people would rise, stoke the fire, tend to animals, pray, talk softly, or even reflect in silence. It was a quiet middle of the night, not dreaded, but accepted. The body simply followed a rhythm shaped by darkness and flame. In some castles, night watch duties aligned with this wakeful period. Guards would patrol the ramparts, checking that no doors were ajar, no coals smouldering in a dangerous way. They wore wool cloaks pulled tight around their shoulders, boots layered with straw or fur. Their torches smoked more than they burned. A few people might rise to relieve themselves. The privy, often little more than a seat above a chute, was chilly, especially in the coldest months. Some households used chamber pots, emptied discreetly in the morning. Smells lingered, but the cold masked much. Others would sit by the fading embers, lost in thought, not anxious, just aware, listening to the quiet crackle of ash, watching the small shadows move across the wall. This time was sometimes used for prayer. Monks in nearby abbeys would rise at set hours to chant the night offices, matins, then lauds. Their voices carried faintly across the hills, a thread of song in the dark. Within castle chapels, a devout lord or lady might rise to join in silence, reading by candlelight or memory. Then, when the body signaled again, people would return to their beds, bundles of wool and straw, cloaks piled atop one another, and second sleep would begin. This phase often held the deeper dreams. First sleep was physical recovery. Second sleep was reflection. If a person remembered a dream in the morning, it likely came from the hours before dawn. The dreams, of course, were private, but sometimes people shared them. Over breakfast, or in the still morning cold, someone might say, "I dreamed of my mother's garden," or "the cow was walking through snow in my sleep again." No one questioned what it meant. Dreams were accepted as small mysteries, like frost on the window, or the way wind moved through keyholes. And still, even during this gentle rhythm of sleep and waking, the castle was not entirely still. Rats moved through the thatch. Owls hunted on silent wings outside the towers. The kitchen fires, though banked, occasionally popped. A pot shifted on its hook. Somewhere, water dripped from a loose stone. There was always motion, if not movement. The castle lived. And when the morning finally came, sometimes with pale light, sometimes just with a sense of time shifting, people rose again. There was no alarm, no bell in most castles, just a shared understanding. The day has come. The coals must be rekindled, the barley ground, the doors unbarred. They rose slowly, shaking off cold and sleep. The same tasks began again. The same wood carried, the same grains stirred, but those quiet, deep hours of night, when the fire whispered and the wind pressed gently against the stone, remained a private part of the day, not recorded in the Chronicles, not spoken of in sermons, just lived quietly, again and again. And so you might ask, if your sleep were broken in the dead of winter, and you sat by the coals in the hush of a castle, what would you think about? Would it be something from the day before? A face? A hope? Or would it be nothing at all? Just peace, silence, and the breathing of walls older than you? By the time winter began to loosen its grip, the people of the castle had already changed. In small, invisible ways, they had learned to listen to silence again. They had relearned patience, not as virtue, but as necessity. They had measured time not in hours, but in candles, in meals, in the number of times they stirred the fire to life. No chronicler ever wrote down the full span of a winter. They mentioned the cold, yes, and the snows that came heavy in February, or the floods that followed the thaw. But they left out what happened every single night. The layers of silence that settled on the stones, the shallow dreams, the stretching of time between dusk and dawn. To live in a castle through a medieval winter was not only to endure cold, but to surrender to it. People did not fight the season. They shaped themselves around it. Like water freezing to the lines of a pot, life settled into the grooves carved by weather and custom. The hearth was the center. Not the throne, not the chapel, not even the storeroom, though it held the keys to survival. The hearth was where warmth came, where bread was made, clothes dried, blisters healed, where stories were passed down and futures guessed at. The hearth did not just burn wood, it burned fear, and around that hearth communities formed, not of choice, but of circumstance. A kitchen servant might sit next to a steward, a visiting cousin beside a nursemaid. The fire didn't know names, it knew only bodies that sought warmth. Every person had a role: the child who fetched kindling, the mother who spun wool by touch, the old man who woke during first sleep and checked the locks, knowing his joints would ache for it in the morning. Their names may never appear in any record. Their work left no monuments. But they held the winter together. And when spring did come, it was not always joyful. It was wet, muddy, slow. Things had spoiled. Barrels had leaked. Boots had worn through, but people had survived, often just barely. And that fact alone was celebrated in small ways. A new loaf made with fresh flour, a tunic mended with bright thread, chickens allowed to wander farther from the coop, a child allowed to walk outside without mittens. These were the rituals of return, not grand festivals, but the quiet reawakening of ordinary life. The Chronicles, meanwhile, moved on. They turned their attention back to kings and borders, to marriages and deaths. The silence of winter vanished from the page. The firelight faded from memory. No one wrote. The household endured the cold with quiet courage. The walls cracked, but held. The people lived, but that is what happened, again and again. And perhaps, if you sat in such a castle now, if you stood in the corner where a rushlight once burned, or laid a hand on a hearthstone blackened by centuries, you would feel it. Not ghosts, not drama, but persistence. Quiet, human persistence. That, more than anything, was the real story of winter nights in castles. Not the danger, not even the cold, but the way people quietly refused to stop living. Not because they believed they would be remembered, but because survival was the only story they knew. So if you had lived then, under heavy blankets in a narrow bed, your breath fogging the air each morning, what would you have taken from those long, dim days? Would you have complained? Or would you have found rhythm, even meaning, in the tasks? That never changed. The nights that never hurried. Would you have realized, long before the chroniclers did, that these were the nights that shaped a lifetime, not because they were grand, but because they were endured? In this gentle beginning, we settle into the dim corridors and echoing refectories of medieval monastic life, where the day's final meal was a ritual of silence, simplicity, and slow repetition. The bells marked time before anything else. In a Benedictine abbey somewhere in northern Europe, perhaps around the year 1273, the sun was falling behind the hilltops, but it was not the sunset that signaled the end of the workday. It was the bell, low, resonant, and familiar. Its sound rolled across the herb garden, stirred the dust in the cloister, and echoed through the kitchen arch where steam curled from the pot still simmering over the hearth. The monks knew this tone. It was not the same bell as terce or sext. This was the call to the final movement of their earthly day, the evening meal. Vespers had already been chanted. The voices had risen and folded back into stone. Now, with the sun low and the halls growing cool, the community of brothers moved with quiet steps toward the refectory. The refectory was not ornate. It was long, tall, and built to focus the eyes downward. High windows let in just enough light to soften the shadows. The wooden benches had been smoothed by decades of robes brushing past. The floor was plain stone, worn in spots where water had pooled from wet sandals, snow, or a spilled bucket of milk. There was no speaking as they entered. Silence had already taken hold. It wasn't an awkward silence. It wasn't strained. It was the kind of silence that had been practiced every day for years, even decades. Each monk knew his place, not by number or hierarchy, but by habit. The youngest novitiate, perhaps a boy of 15, cheeks still holding the softness of youth, walked behind a brother who had not spoken during meals for 30 winters. The evening meal was known as collation, though its exact time and contents varied by season and abbey. In midsummer, it might be a bit later, after some work was still done in the gardens. In winter, it came early, before the light slipped away entirely and cold fingers fumbled with bread crusts. After sundown, people would sleep for a few hours. Then they would wake, naturally, often around midnight or slightly after. This interval could last an hour or more. During that time, people would rise, stoke the fire, tend to animals, pray, talk softly, or even reflect in silence. It was a quiet middle of the night, not dreaded but accepted. The body simply followed a rhythm shaped by darkness and flame. In some castles, night watch duties aligned with this wakeful period. Guards would patrol the ramparts, checking that no doors were ajar, no coals smouldering in a dangerous way. They wore wool cloaks pulled tight around their shoulders, boots layered with straw or fur. Their torches smoked more than they burned. A few people might rise to relieve themselves. The privy, often little more than a seat above a chute, was chilly, especially in the coldest months. Some households used chamber pots, emptied discreetly in the morning. Smells lingered, but the cold masked much. Others would sit by the fading embers, lost in thought. Not anxious, just aware, listening to the quiet crackle of ash, watching the small shadows move across the wall. This time was sometimes used for prayer. Monks in nearby abbeys would rise at set hours to chant the night, offices, matins, then lauds. Their voices carried faintly across the hills, a thread of song in the dark. Within castle chapels, a devout lord or lady might rise to join in silence, reading by candlelight or memory. Then, when the body signalled again, people would return to their beds, bundles of wool and straw, cloaks piled atop one another. And second sleep would begin. This phase often held the deeper dreams. First sleep was physical recovery. Second sleep was reflection. If a person remembered a dream in the morning, it likely came from the hours before dawn. The dreams, of course, were private, but sometimes people shared them. Over breakfast or in the still morning cold, someone might say, "I dreamed of my mother's garden," or "the cow was walking through snow in my sleep again." No one questioned what it meant. Dreams were accepted as small mysteries, like frost on the window, or the way wind moved through keyholes. And still, even during this gentle rhythm of sleep and waking, the castle was not entirely still. Rats moved through the thatch. Owls hunted on silent wings outside the towers. The kitchen fires, though banked, occasionally popped. A pot shifted on its hook. Somewhere, water dripped from a loose stone. There was always motion, if not movement. The castle lived, and when the morning finally came, sometimes with pale light, sometimes just with a sense of time shifting, people rose again. There was no alarm, no bell in most castles, just a shared understanding. The day has come. The coals must be rekindled, the barley ground, the doors unbarred. They rose slowly, shaking off cold and sleep. The same tasks began again. The same wood carried, the same grain stirred. But those quiet, deep hours of night, when the fire whispered and the wind pressed gently against the stone, remained a private part of the day, not recorded in the Chronicles, not spoken of in sermons, just lived quietly again and again. And so you might ask, if your sleep were broken in the dead of winter, and you sat by the coals in the hush of a castle, what would you think about? Would it be something from the day before? A face? A hope? Or would it be nothing at all? Just peace, silence, and the breathing of walls older than you. By the time winter began to loosen its grip, the people of the castle had already changed in small, invisible ways. They had learned to listen to silence again. They had relearned patience, not as virtue, but as necessity. They had measured time, not in hours, but in candles, in meals, in the number of times they stirred the fire to life. No chronicler ever wrote down the full span of a winter. They mentioned the cold, yes, and the snows that came heavy in February, or the floods that followed the thaw. But they left out what happened every single night, the layers of silence that settled on the stones, the shallow dreams, the stretching of time between dusk and dawn. To live in a castle through a medieval winter was not only to endure cold, but to surrender to it. People did not fight the season. They shaped themselves around it. Like water freezing to the lines of a pot, life settled into the grooves carved by weather and custom. The hearth was the center, not the throne, not the chapel, not even the storeroom, though it held the keys to survival. The hearth was where warmth came, where bread was made, clothes dried, blisters healed, where stories were passed down and futures guessed at. The hearth did not just burn wood, it burned fear. And around that hearth communities formed, not of choice, but of circumstance. A kitchen servant might sit next to a steward, a visiting cousin beside a nursemaid. The fire didn't know names. It knew only bodies that sought warmth. Every person had a role. The child who fetched kindling, the mother who spun wool by touch, the old man who woke during first sleep and checked the locks, knowing his joints would ache for it in the morning. Their names may never appear in any record. Their work left no monuments, but they held the winter together, and when spring did come, it was not always joyful. It was wet, muddy, slow. Things had spoiled, barrels had leaked, boots had worn through, but people had survived, often just barely, and that fact alone was celebrated in small ways. A new loaf made with fresh flour, a tunic mended with bright thread, chickens allowed to wander farther from the coop, a child allowed to walk outside without mittens. These were the rituals of return. Not grand festivals, but the quiet reawakening of ordinary life. The Chronicles, meanwhile, moved on. They turned their attention back to kings and borders, to marriages and deaths. The silence of winter vanished from the page. The firelight faded from memory. No one wrote. The household endured the cold with quiet courage. The walls cracked, but held. The people lived. But that is what happened, again and again. And perhaps, if you sat in such a castle now, if you stood in the corner where a rushlight once burned, or laid a hand on a hearthstone blackened by centuries, you would feel it. Not ghosts, not drama, but persistence. Quiet, human persistence. That, more than anything, was the real story of winter nights in castles. Not the danger, not even the cold, but the way people quietly refused to stop living. Not because they believed they would be remembered, but because survival was the only story they knew. So if you had lived then, under heavy blankets in a narrow bed, your breath fogging the air each morning, what would you have taken from those long, dim days? Would you have complained? Or would you have found rhythm, even meaning, in the tasks that never changed, the nights that never hurried? Would you have realized, long before the chroniclers did, that these were the nights that shaped a lifetime, not because they were grand, but because they were endured? In this gentle beginning, we settle into the dim corridors and echoing refectories of medieval monastic life, where the day's final meal was a ritual of silence, simplicity, and slow repetition. The bells marked time before anything else. In a Benedictine abbey somewhere in northern Europe, perhaps around the year 1273, the sun was falling behind the hilltops, but it was not the sunset that signaled the end of the workday. It was the bell, low, resonant, and familiar. Its sound rolled across the herb garden, stirred the dust in the cloister, and echoed through the kitchen arch where steam curled from the pot still simmering over the hearth. The monks knew this tone. It was not the same bell as terce or sext. This was the call to the final movement of their earthly day, the evening meal. Vespers had already been chanted. The voices had risen and folded back into stone. Now, with the sun low and the halls growing cool, the community of brothers moved with quiet steps toward the refectory. The refectory was not ornate. It was long, tall, and built to focus the eyes downward. High windows let in just enough light to soften the shadows. The wooden benches had been smoothed by decades of robes brushing past. The floor was plain stone, worn in spots where water had pooled from wet sandals, snow, or a spilled bucket of milk. There was no speaking as they entered. Silence had already taken hold. It wasn't an awkward silence. It wasn't strained. It was the kind of silence that had been practiced every day for years, even decades. Each monk knew his place, not by number or hierarchy, but by habit. The youngest novitiate, perhaps a boy of 15, cheeks still holding the softness of youth, walked behind a brother who had not spoken during meals for 30 winters. The evening meal was known as collation, though its exact time and contents varied by season and abbey. In midsummer, it might be a bit later, after some work was still done in the gardens. In winter, it came early, before the light slipped away entirely and cold fingers fumbled with bread crusts. The rules of St. Benedict, written long before this night and followed still, guided the meal's shape. No meat from four-footed animals. That was reserved for the sick. Bread, vegetables, and legumes were standard. Wine, diluted with water, might be offered in moderation. But more important than the food was the act of restraint. A monk did not dine to indulge his body. He dined to sustain his soul's ability to serve. Every bite was part of that quiet discipline. Still, the food mattered. It had to be prepared. It had to be harvested, stored, measured. Someone, often the kitchener, a monk assigned to manage the food, had risen before dawn to check the stores, gather the onions, cut the root vegetables, and plan the potage. Another brother had sifted flour. A third had stoked the fire. And the cellarer, responsible for all supplies, had checked that the salted fish had thawed enough to be edible by dusk. Tonight, they would eat lentil stew. It wasn't remarkable, except in the way that repetition can become its own form of beauty. The lentils had been grown in the abbey garden the previous summer. They had dried in the loft above the granary. A novice had soaked them this morning in a basin of stone-cold water, then added them to the pot with leeks and a small twist of herbs. The herbs had been chosen carefully. Marjoram for digestion, a little thyme, maybe a pinch of parsley if it had survived the frost. Nothing was done for flavour alone. Everything had purpose, even the smallest leaf. At the tables, bowls were already set out. Wood, not ceramic. Each one a little different. Some bore notches or smooth patches where years of spoons had worn them down. The spoons were also wood, carved by the monks themselves, each brother keeping his own. They were not passed around, and it was considered disrespectful to borrow another man's spoon. As the community filed in, they bowed slightly, crossed themselves, and took their seats. The abbot entered last. He sat at the head, not to preside like a king, but to anchor the circle. His presence was less commanding than calming. He had eaten here more nights than most of the brothers had lived. His face was marked with age, not in a sagging way, but in the kind of stillness that comes when a man has not rushed in years. At his signal, the reader stood. There was always a reader during dinner. While the others ate in silence, one brother read aloud from a sacred or moral text. It might be the lives of the saints, the rules of the order, or a passage from the Psalms. Occasionally, it might be something practical, advice on planting times, or a lesson from an early church father on humility. The reader had practiced beforehand. He had stood in the cold corridor behind the scriptorium, mumbling his passage, to the stone wall to hear how it would sound. He had cleaned his throat with warm water. He had unrolled the parchment slowly, taking care not to smudge the ink. Now, as the others dipped their spoons into steaming stew, he began. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The room listened, not just out of duty, but out of habit. The words fell in rhythm with the clink of spoon on bowl, the faint creak of benches, the occasional sniff of someone with a winter cold. The food was simple, but filling. 2 pieces of bread accompanied the stew, coarse, dark, and slightly sour, from the barley and rye. The crust was thick and hard. Some soaked it in their stew. Others chewed slowly, letting the bite soften in their mouths. On special days, a saint's feast perhaps, or an important date in the liturgical calendar, there might be an addition: a piece of soft cheese, an extra spoon of honey on barley, pudding, even a baked apple, split between 2 brothers. These were not indulgences, but signs of celebration, and because they came so rarely, they mattered more. Tonight was not a feast. It was an ordinary winter evening. And yet, in the repetition, there was something sacred, a quiet feast of its own kind. The youngest monk, sitting near the kitchen door, finished slowly. He did not scrape his bowl, that was frowned upon, but he let the last spoonful rest in his mouth, tasting it not like a child tastes candy, but like someone who understood the labor behind the lentils. He had peeled onions this morning. His hands still carried a faint sting from the juice. He had stirred the pot when Brother Gerald's back had given out. He knew which patch of leeks had supplied the greens. It made the bowl more than a meal. It made it a memory. The reader closed his parchment with care. A pause. Then the community rose together, bowls and spoons left behind for the kitchen helpers. They bowed their heads in thanksgiving, not with words, but with posture. The silence was not broken. It simply followed them, room to room, like the draught from the high windows. In the kitchen, 2 monks began to wash the bowls in wooden tubs of warm water. The warmth was welcome. The steam softened the skin on their hands. They worked methodically, not chatting, just moving with the rhythm of habit. Outside, the sky had darkened entirely. A single lantern was lit at the refectory door, its glow flickering on the wall like a gentle breath. A dog barked somewhere beyond the wall, then fell silent again. Within the abbey, the monks moved toward Compline, the final prayers of the night. Their stomachs were not full, but they were content. They would sleep soon. The fire in the small hearth would be banked. The pages of scripture would be closed. The halls would echo with footsteps once more, then grow still. And so it went, again and again, season by season, meal by meal. No one chronicled the stew. No one catalogued the bread. But in those bowls, held by tired hands under flickering light, the soul was fed with more than food. And you might wonder if you sat there one evening, soup warming your palms, steam touching your face, what would you notice first? The flavor, the silence, or the quiet sense that nothing grand was needed to feel complete? The calendar ruled everything, but it did not wear a crown. In the world outside the abbey, kings and bishops argued over land, tariffs, and relics. But inside the walls, it was the liturgical calendar, the unchanging, repeating cycle of fasts and feasts, that truly governed a monk's life. It marked time, not in years or dynasties, but in the repetition of sacred days and the quiet adjustments they brought to even the most ordinary things, like dinner. At first glance, the monk's meal might seem the same each night: a bowl of something warm, bread, rough and crusted, watered wine in a wooden cup, silence, prayer. But under that surface stillness, there lived an entire ecosystem of change. The rule of Saint Benedict had not demanded monotony. It had invited attention to order. And within that order, subtle variations crept in, not for pleasure, but for deeper purpose. As the months shifted, so too did the ingredients. In the spring, the kitchen monk stepped more lightly. His steps were brisker, his breath less visible in the air. The ground, once frozen, had softened. The kitchen gardens behind the herbarium stirred with life. Dandelion greens, once dismissed as weeds, were now picked by hand and added to broth. The first sorrel leaves, tart and bright, brought a welcome sharpness to otherwise bland stews. Lambs, not eaten, bleated in distant pens. The monks never consumed meat from four-legged animals. That was a strict interpretation of the rule, though some abbeys, especially in later centuries or in colder climates, made exceptions, particularly for the sick. But in the strictest communities, meat was for convalescents only, and even then, it was served in a separate room so the healthy would not see or smell it. The sight of roasting meat, the aroma of fat rendered by fire, such things, it was believed, awakened the flesh in ways that silence could not contain. So they relied on what the seasons gave them. In summer, the abundance was almost startling. Beans, cabbage, garlic. The monks harvested them themselves, shoulders bending beneath the sun, robes soaked through with sweat. They had schedules for the fields, just as they had for prayers. 1 hour to weed, 1 hour to haul water from the well, another to sort potatoes in the cool cellar beneath the granary, where it always smelled of damp clay and old roots. Summer meals had a freshness to them, not richness, never that, but lightness. Peas mashed with mint, carrots braised until soft. On days when the bees were cooperative and the weather had been kind, the cellarer might approve a few spoonfuls of honey for a barley pudding. This, eaten in silence while a brother read from St. Augustine's Reflections on Sin, offered a strange contrast, sweetness in the mouth, severity in the ear. But perhaps the most complex meals came in winter, not because they were indulgent, far from it, but because they required planning, patience, and skill. Winter meals were about preservation. The cellar was king now. Dried beans, salted fish, smoked onions, apples stored in straw-lined crates. The kitchen's cold corners held row after row of clay pots filled with pickled vegetables, fermented turnips, and jars of sauerkraut, all crafted with monastic precision. One monk had spent 3 full weeks chopping cabbages before the frost came. His hands had blistered, his knife had dulled, but he worked in rhythm with the bells, slicing, salting, packing, until every jar was sealed. These sour vegetables, uncelebrated in fine courts and never painted in feast-day art, were lifesavers. Without them, illness would creep into bones and bellies. The monks didn't use the word vitamins, of course, but they understood that after a long stretch of dried bread and grain, the body needed something sharp, something green, something alive. They ate more slowly in the winter. Not from choice, but because cold made the fingers stiff. A simple bowl of turnip broth took longer to bring to the lips. Even the wine, diluted and stored in stone jugs, took on a chill that bit the throat. A brother would sometimes warm his spoon over the hearth before beginning, just for a moment. A small rebellion, perhaps, or just a practical kindness. But food wasn't only determined by weather, it was also shaped, deeply and deliberately, by the calendar of saints. Each day bore a name, some well-known, St. Peter, St. Benedict, the Virgin Mary, others obscure, St. Godileva, St. Ethelburga, St. Wulfatrude. These saints became companions in the monk's daily rhythm. On ordinary days, meals were sparse. On feast days, the kitchen stirred to different life. There might be an extra ladle of stew, a soft cheese brought up from the dairy, a fig dried and tucked into the bread. These were not luxuries as the outside world knew them. They were markers, signals. Each extra morsel pointed to the joy of remembrance. On the feast of St. Martin, for instance, November 11th, some abbeys blessed and shared roasted goose, especially in regions where the weather had already turned cruel. But in stricter orders, the day was marked instead by a richer lentil stew, perhaps with almonds or a fresh herb garnish. Something small but noticed. Lent, however, brought a stripping down. During this long fast, 40 days leading to Easter, dinners became near monastic rituals of denial. No dairy, no eggs, just flatbread, broth and vegetables, served without embellishment. Some communities even avoided cooking altogether 1 day a week, eating only raw or soaked grains. This was not punishment, it was preparation. The monks did not grumble, or if they did, it was silently, within the heart. But not all feasts brought more food. Some brought only greater attentiveness. On the eve of a major holy day, dinner was consumed more slowly. The reader might recite a longer passage. Candles might be lit along the wall, casting gold onto the pale stone. In such light, even plain fare seemed different. One winter, the kitchen had run out of onions early. A bad harvest. The frost had come too soon. That night, the stew was thinner, blander. The monks chewed slowly, their faces unreadable. And yet, after dinner, one brother wrote in his private devotional that the emptiness in the bowl had reminded him of the desert fathers, those early monks who had lived with even less. The absence had become presence, the lack had become fullness. It was an odd truth in the monastery. Sometimes the most memorable meals were those with the least to remember. Even the preparation of the meal had layers of meaning. Cooking was considered a service, a sacrifice. The monk assigned to the kitchen rotated each week, though the head kitchener remained constant. That rotating monk did not attend all the day's prayers. He missed parts of Lauds and Vespers. He prayed while chopping leeks, while boiling beans, while washing the stones where herbs were crushed. He offered his time, his heat, his hands. And for this he was honoured, though never with applause, just with the silent knowledge that his work had nourished the brothers for one more day. There were no recipes written down. Cooking was not a science, but an act of memory. Each dish passed down through wordless observation. The way to balance lentils with leeks, the amount of salt. A winter stew could take how many dried mushrooms softened in water made a broth thick enough to be called dinner. Sometimes a novice ruined a meal. He might forget the salt. He might let the stew burn while tending the door. When that happened, there was no shouting. The brothers ate in silence as always. But after dinner, the novice might find himself peeling potatoes late into the night, the smoke of his small candle dancing on the wall. The next day, he would do better. Evening meals were also moments of unspoken communication. An older monk with trembling hands might be helped, wordlessly, by the brother beside him, his spoon adjusted, his cup lifted. These small gestures, unseen by the world, were more binding than sermons, and so the calendar continued. Winter into spring, spring into summer, saints' days, fasts, and ordinary time, Lent, Advent, Pentecost, and always the dinners, not feasts in the worldly sense, but rituals of repetition, of attention, of silent gratitude. If you had walked into the refectory on one of those nights, wearing borrowed robes, your eyes not yet adjusted to the candlelight, you might have thought nothing special was happening. But if you had stayed, watched the way the bowls were passed, the way no one looked up when the reader stumbled, the way the youngest monk wiped the spoon of the oldest before handing it back, then maybe you'd begin to see it. Not the food, but the way it fed more than hunger, and you might wonder, how long does it take for repetition to become reverence? No meal appears from nowhere. In a monastery, nothing ever truly did. Everything had a rhythm, a root, a reason. Behind every bowl of barley soup, behind every crust of bread, there were hands, many hands, working quietly, steadily, often without thanks, to keep the great wheel of the abbey turning. The evening meal, simple though it seemed, was the result of hundreds of quiet tasks done faithfully over weeks and months. There was no chef, no single cook who invented recipes or stirred sauces to applause. There was instead a rotating cast of monks, guided by duty, not desire. and overseen by one man, the cellarer. The cellarer was not just a storehouse keeper, he was one of the most important officers in the entire monastery. His job was vast and delicate. He oversaw the food supply, ensured that storage was in order, tracked what had been harvested and what still lay in the fields. He coordinated with the gardener, the baker, the beekeeper, the brewer. He managed the arrival of trade goods, approved purchases from nearby villages, and ensured that the sick had what they needed. He could not allow waste. He could not permit excess. His was the balancing act of faith and flour. Each day, after prime but before terse, the cellarer would walk the long, cool corridor to the storage rooms. These were not simple cupboards. They were architectural achievements, often carved directly into stone, cool in summer, dry in winter. Some were underground, sealed with thick oak doors bound in iron. Inside, one could find sacks of rye and barley, coils of dried herbs hung from beams, clay jugs of oil, stacks of salted fish wrapped in linen, wheels of hard cheese with their dates marked in chalk. Inventory was kept by memory, by habit, and sometimes with wax tablets. There was no shopping list. The cellarer simply knew, by the weight of a barrel, by the shape of a sack, what was running low. He would make quiet notes to himself, then speak with the prior or abbot if something more costly was needed, like lamp oil or spices. Spices were not absent in monastic kitchens, but they were used with restraint. Pepper, cumin, saffron, and cloves. These arrived not from nearby fields, but from distant lands, often carried overland by merchants and then transferred at port cities. They were expensive, precious. So the cellarer kept them in a locked chest, doling out small amounts on holy days or when the medicinal cook required them. A single pinch of saffron might be enough to tint a whole pot of rice, should rice be available. A few peppercorns, ground and scattered over lentils, could feel like celebration. But monks were not merchants, and their focus was not flavour, but function. Below the cellarer were assistants, junior monks, often in training, who learned the system by working it. They swept the granaries, checked for signs of weevils in the flour, cleaned the racks where fish were laid out to dry. They were taught to recognize rot by smell, not sight. They learned the best time to open a barrel of salted herring and how to reseal it with wax-soaked cloth. Then there was the kitchener, not a chef in the modern sense, but the monk in charge of kitchen operations for a given period, usually a week. The role rotated, giving each brother a chance to serve. But it was not a role taken lightly. A bad kitchener could spoil the rhythm of the whole house. He woke before the others. He prepared the fires, fetched the water, sorted the ingredients. He made decisions, not about menus, which were usually fixed, but about method. Should the oats be cooked slowly or soaked overnight? Was the cabbage better steamed or stewed? Which herbs might mask the taste of slightly spoiled barley? The kitchener cooked while listening. Listening not to conversation, there was none, but to the crackle of the fire, the boil of pots, the footsteps of the novice bringing firewood, the whisper of robes behind him as a brother swept the floor. These were his companions. This was his orchestra. And always, the bells. The bells marked the time for prayers, and the monk in the kitchen had to pause. Even in the midst of stirring a pot or kneading dough, he would bow his head, silently acknowledge the hour, and perhaps whisper the opening line of the next office. Deus, in adjutorium, meum intend. O God, come to my assistance. His work was prayer. His cooking, a form of devotion. Once the meal was prepared, it was carried to the refectory. Long, narrow, lit by windows too high for distraction, the refectory was not a place of festivity. It was a place of order. Rows of benches. A raised pulpit for the reader. A cupboard for plates and bowls. Nothing decorative. Nothing wasteful. Even the plates were often made of wood or pewter. Simple, durable, serviceable. Before the meal began, the monks lined up silently and washed their hands. The lavabo, the basin for washing, was usually just outside the refectory, fed by a simple aqueduct or spring channel. Cold water, rough linen towels, then silence again. Hands clean, robes straightened, they would enter one by one, take their place, and wait for the abbot's signal. The reader for the day would stand, open the chosen text, usually a life of a saint or a commentary on scripture, and begin. The voice was calm, unhurried, monotone. While the words floated through the air, the food was served. Not all monks received the same portion. The refectorian, another officer in the abbey, kept notes about who was ill, who was fasting, who had worked more heavily that day. Older monks often ate less, younger ones more, but no one asked, no one chose. The bowls were placed in front of each man, and each man accepted what was given. Sometimes the bread was stale. It was soaked in broth. Sometimes the stew was thin. It was eaten anyway. Sometimes the wine had soured. It was still poured, then blessed, then consumed with thanks. If a monk dropped his spoon, he picked it up in silence. If he spilled, he cleaned it without shame. If the reader coughed, he paused. The rhythm never broke. And when the last spoonful was eaten, the last word read, the meal ended, not with a clatter, but with a prayer. Benedicite. Let us bless the Lord. And all would murmur, Deo gratias. Thanks be to God. After the meal, the dishes were cleaned, often by the novices. The water was cold. The soap, made from lye and ash, was rough on the hands, but no one complained. Complaining was seen as a form of vanity, placing one's discomfort above the good of the house. Broken bowls were repaired with wax or discarded. Crumbs were swept into a cloth and fed to chickens or pigs. Leftover stew was rare, but when it happened, it was given to the poor at the abbey gates. Because even in austerity the monks gave, they knew hunger. They knew what it meant to live on the edge of enough, and so, when they could spare it, they did. There was no feast without memory of famine, no comfort without remembrance of need, and so the rhythm continued. One monk would step down as kitchener. Another would take his place. The cellarer would note the change, adjust the schedule, and update his mental inventory. The reader would choose a new book. The bread would be baked again, the beans soaked, the wine diluted, the fire lit, and once again the monks would gather, sit, listen, eat, pray, night after night, year after year. If you watched from above, say from the rafters, or imagined yourself as a bird nesting in the eaves, you'd see not monotony, but care. You'd see that each meal was an act of trust, that the monks believed the stew would be warm, the bread sufficient, the story read clearly, that no one would speak out of turn, or hoard food, or rise before the prayer was done, that each man would do his part, and in doing so, the house would hold. This was not just dinner, it was covenant. And you might ask yourself, how many lifetimes would it take for the ordinary to feel sacred? There was a calendar before there were clocks, and long before dinner became something you ordered or scheduled, it was something you received, shaped by seasons, by silence, and by the slow passage of holy time. In a medieval monastery, the year was not broken into months as we think of them now, but into liturgical seasons. These seasons flowed gently into one another, some marked by fasting, others by feasting, many by both. The days were not numbered by dates, but by saints. You would not hear March 15th, but rather the feast of St. Longinus. Dinner, in this system, followed the calendar like a quiet echo. It changed not through choice, but through rhythm. The simplest way to begin understanding this rhythm is to divide the year in two, Lent and not Lent. Lent, the 40 days before. Easter was a time of restraint, austerity, introspection. In many monasteries, this meant no meat at all, sometimes no dairy. In stricter houses, even fish was limited. Butter might be replaced with oil, cheese omitted entirely, and any hint of richness removed. The dinner during Lent was often built around pulses, lentils, chickpeas or peas, served warm, sometimes with turnips or onions, sometimes just with herbs and a trace of vinegar. Bread remained, but wine might be watered down even more than usual. Dessert, if one could call it that, was often dried apple or a preserved plum, soaked to softness and served without sugar. But Lent was not sorrowful. The monks did not complain. To them, this seasonal simplicity was a return, a clearing away, a kind of spiritual fasting that echoed into the belly. And as spring arrived, they could almost feel the renewal not just in the chapel hymns, but in the stew, fresh greens returning to the pot, wild garlic reappearing near the hedges, nettles gathered at dawn and stirred gently into the broth. Eastertide, when it arrived, was not a feast of opulence, but of gentle abundance. The monastery might serve eggs, soft-boiled, salted, sometimes served with fresh cheese curds from the morning's milking. Honey might return to the table, a bit of butter, a glass of wine less diluted, bread baked with a handful of cracked walnuts. It wasn't indulgence, but recognition. The resurrection was celebrated through nourishment. Summer meals reflected the garden's gifts. Broad beans, cabbages, leeks, fennel and carrots became staples. The monks would sometimes dry herbs for later use, crushing mint and parsley between stone fingers, or hanging thyme in shaded corners to preserve its pungency. Dinner during summer might feature fresh herb stews, sometimes with barley, sometimes with thick slices of root vegetables simmered in clay pots over the fire. If it was a feast day, say the Feast of St. Benedict or the Nativity of John the Baptist, there might even be cheese warmed with herbs or fritters made from leftover porridge, fried in oil and lightly salted. The monastery's beehives were also active in summer. Bees, carefully tended, provided honey that was harvested once or twice a year. This was reserved mostly for the sick or for the sacristy, but now and then a small spoonful might sweeten a broth on a special day. Then came harvest time, not a single event, but a slow winding down of the sun. In late summer and early autumn, dinner might include stewed apples with cinnamon or onion and barley porridge, thickened with milk and served warm. If the vineyards had yielded, wine would be slightly stronger. If the mushrooms had sprouted safely, they might be cooked into a dark, earthy paste and served with bread. The Feast of Michaelmas on September 29th was a moment of quiet gratitude. The harvest was mostly in, and monks gave thanks for survival, more than abundance. On such a night, dinner might include roast onions stuffed with herbs, chestnut puree, or a rare portion of freshwater fish, perhaps gifted by a nearby lord or caught from the monastery's own pond. Not all monasteries had fishing rights, but those that did treated fish as both a luxury and a responsibility. Eels, for example, were particularly prized, not for their taste alone, but for their storage power. They could be smoked, dried, and even buried in salt for use deep into winter. And so, we arrive at winter, the darkest season, and perhaps the most challenging. Dinner in winter was often repetitive, but warm. That was its virtue. Cabbage and leeks, barley, carrots stored in sand, beans from the cellar, bread that was slightly tougher, sometimes blackened at the edges, a hot drink of watered wine or ale, barely fermented, sometimes thickened with oats and sweetened with dried berries. There were nights when the wind howled through the cloisters, when the candles flickered and the kitchen fire barely held its warmth. But dinner still arrived, slow and simple. Christmas was not a feast in the way we imagine now. There were no geese or puddings, no sugar-dusted cakes or wine in goblets. But the monks marked the night with care. They might bake a denser bread, using better flour. The refectory might be lit with extra candles. A small date or fig might be placed beside each bowl. Symbols, perhaps, of the sweetness of grace. The reader might choose a passage from the Gospels, and the bells would ring before the meal in a gentler tone. Dinner, then, reflected the soul of the season, not its excess. Even within these seasons, though, there were dozens of feast days, quiet elevations of the ordinary. Not every feast meant richer food. but it often meant slightly more of it. A second course, a softer cheese, a bit more wine. The monks did not need fireworks. A ladle of warm honeyed milk, served after Compline on the Feast of St. Martin, was enough. Every day, the calendar whispered what the table should hold, and behind every whisper was someone listening. The cellarer adjusted his plans, the kitchener measured his barley, the gardener clipped his herbs more carefully, the beekeeper visited his hives, the reader prepared a new saint's story, and the refectorian laid out just enough bowls, just enough bread. Because dinner was never just food, it was remembrance, it was season, sacrifice, and silence, stitched together with the thread of faith. And even as snow gathered on the cloister arches, the monks came to table, heads bowed, hands clean, ears open, eating not to celebrate themselves, but to nourish their devotion. Which leads us to wonder, if a meal is shaped not by appetite, but by time and prayer, does it still feed the body first, or something deeper? In a monastery, no single person cooked in the way we imagine a modern chef. There was no one figure sweating over a stove, barking orders, or creatively assembling dishes by instinct. Instead, dinner was made possible by a system, a quiet collection of roles carried out as part of the divine rhythm of monastic life. The kitchen was not merely a room, it was a responsibility, a duty of service, rotated and accepted with humility. At the center of this network stood the kitchener. He was not a cook exactly, but a monk responsible for overseeing the preparation of food. Often an older monk with experience, the kitchener was chosen for his calm demeanor and practical sense. His task was not to innovate, but to provide. Every day, he would consult the cellarer, who managed the supplies, and the refectorian, who handled the dining room and utensils. Together, they reviewed the day's requirements. Was it a fasting day? A feast day? A saint's commemoration? A regular Wednesday in Lent? Accordingly, quantities were adjusted. Recipes were not written down, but remembered. And even then, they were simple. Boiled lentils, stewed leeks, roasted onions with vinegar and herbs. But simplicity did not mean ease. The kitchen required firewood, often gathered from monastery lands. Fires had to be lit well before sunrise, especially in winter. Large iron cauldrons were scrubbed and prepared. Barley needed soaking. Beans needed hours of simmering. Water had to be drawn from wells or streams. Each monk in the kitchen performed a small silent role, peeling, chopping, grinding spices, or stirring pots slowly with worn wooden paddles that had passed through generations. No garlic was wasted, no crumb of bread discarded. Near the door of the kitchen hung a bell rope to summon assistance or mark the arrival of mealtime. The bell was not rung with urgency. It was more of a whisper, a subtle reminder that dinner was ready for those in prayer. Then there was the cellarer, a vital figure, often second only to the abbot in importance. The cellarer maintained the stocks: grain, salt, oil, wine, vegetables, preserved fruits, and occasionally meat or fish. His domain included pantries, granaries, cellars, and gardens. He was expected to know what remained in storage to the handful, and to ensure that nothing spoiled. The cellarer worked closely with the gardener, whose rows of leeks, beans, and onions supplied most of the fresh food from spring to autumn. In well-endowed monasteries, the cellarer might also supervise orchards, fish ponds, vineyards, or even small flocks. In leaner communities, he walked to town markets on designated days, negotiating with merchants or bartering eggs for onions, apples for salt. He was frugal, precise, and prayerful. His labor, though practical, was considered a sacred stewardship. Even dishes and utensils had their own steward. The refectorian managed the plates, bowls, knives, and jugs, ensuring everything was clean and in place. He also arranged the dining hall before each meal, long wooden tables, washed benches, and sometimes, depending on the season, candles to break the early dusk. But he had one more duty, placing the bookstand, because every dinner was accompanied, not by conversation, but by reading. The reader was another monk, assigned for the day. Before the meal, he would step up to the lectern and read from the lives of saints, scriptures, or moral texts. His voice, soft and steady, would fill the silence as monks dipped bread into broth or spooned up lentils from their bowls. No one responded. No one interrupted. Reading during dinner was not entertainment. It was formation. A second nourishment. Food for the mind and soul. On particularly solemn nights, such as Good Friday or the vigil of a great feast, even the reading might be omitted. Silence would stretch unbroken from bell to bell, and in that silence monks would hear the sounds of dinner, the ladle tapping the pot, the low creak of benches, the swallow of wine, the breath before a prayer. But all of this, kitchen work, serving, cleaning, was never considered separate from prayer. It was all a form of liturgy. When a monk washed a pot, he did so slowly, as if cleansing the tools of a chapel. When he swept breadcrumbs from the floor, he did not hurry. The rule of Saint Benedict reminded the brothers that all utensils and goods of the monastery are to be treated as sacred vessels of the altar, even a wooden spoon. In some monasteries, meals were prepared in rotation. The entire community took turns in the kitchen. In others, certain monks were assigned longer stints, especially if they had experience, skill, or physical strength. But in every case, the task was approached without ego. No monk was the cook. He was merely serving for a time before another took his place. There were even prayers for kitchen work. Some were brief, invoking strength, endurance, and humility. Others were longer, murmured while cutting onions or stirring pots, using the rhythm of the task as a kind of rosary. And when dinner ended, monks stood silently. They recited a final prayer. Then they placed their empty bowls and knives back in the designated basket. Cleaning was done quietly. Ashes were carried out. Leftovers, rare though they were given to the poor or kept for the next day's early meal. Nothing wasted, no praise expected. In this system, dinner was not the result of inspiration, but of participation. Every monk played a part, and the food reflected that shared effort. There was no applause, no compliments, no innovation, only the quiet satisfaction that everyone had eaten, that the rhythm of the day had been honored, that even in the most mundane, chore prayer had taken root. The dinner, humble as it was, became a mirror. It reflected the monastery's structure, its balance, and its beliefs. From the cellarer's ledgers to the gardener's harvest, from the kitchener's steady hands to the reader's gentle voice, each role made the meal possible. And yet the question remains, if no single monk can be called the cook, then who, truly, prepares the meal? Is it the community, the calendar, or something greater, moving quietly beneath the surface? In the life of a medieval monk, time did not flow like a river. It circled, like the hands of a clock turning around sacred moments. And the rhythm that marked that circle was the liturgical calendar, a web of feast days, fasts, vigils, saints, remembrances, and holy seasons. Each day to the outside world might look nearly the same, but inside the abbey walls, dinner was a quiet reflection of the spiritual season. Most evenings featured a sparse and consistent offering: bread, legumes, vegetables, and perhaps a touch of oil. But when the calendar pointed to something special, a Saint's Day, a festival, or a solemn celebration, the routine shifted just enough to be noticed. These were the quiet feasts, not loud or indulgent. There were no roasted pigs or overflowing goblets. But still, a monk might glance at his bowl and find something different: a few stewed apples sweetened with honey, a small wedge of firm cheese, a rare bit of fish spiced more richly than usual, or, on especially notable days, a sip of wine, rather than the usual watered beer. The change was modest, but in monastic life, it felt momentous. Feast days began before dinner, of course. The bells rang longer that morning. The chapel was filled with softer light. Candles left to burn longer. Monks processed through the cloisters in slower rhythm. Some feast days called for special hymns, others for entire masses offered in the middle of the day. And when the sun began to lower and the hour for dinner approached, there was a hushed anticipation, not for luxury, but for meaning. Take, for example, the feast of Saint Benedict, celebrated in early July. On this day, monks honouring their founder might receive 3 courses at dinner instead of 1. Perhaps a warm barley soup with garden herbs, a platter of preserved vegetables dressed with vinegar and mustard seed, and finally, a small portion of honeyed milk or soft cheese served with flatbread. The food wasn't elaborate, but it was prepared with extra care and often served with a smile from the cellarer or novice assisting at the tables. Even gestures of generosity were kept within the bounds of silence. Other feast days carried specific regional flavours. In Normandy, a monastery might prepare salted fish on the feast of St. Michael, reflecting the archangel's protector role over seafarers. In England, the Feast of All Saints might include root vegetables roasted in ash, eaten by candlelight, as the wind howled beyond the thick stone walls. In some southern abbeys, especially near vineyards, the monks received a half-cup of local, red wine on the Feast of Corpus Christi, a symbolic echo of the blood of Christ. The wine was never enough to cause intoxication, only to remind the drinker of sacred abundance. And then there were the seasonal markers, the first radish of spring, the last apple of winter, or the newly milled flour after harvest. These too became feasts, not because of how much they offered, but because of what they represented: change, continuity, and the earth's slow turning. But even on feast days, silence remained. A visiting abbot once wrote in his diary upon joining a Cistercian feast for the Assumption, "The table was set with plain jugs and 4 kinds of pottage. The monks did not smile nor sing, but I could feel their joy. It was not on their faces, but in the way they passed the salt with gentleness, the way they bowed their heads as if to say, 'We are fed, and that is enough.' There were rules too. The rule of Saint Benedict, and many monastic customs based on it, limited how feast days were to be observed. The kitchener might be permitted extra supplies, but never extravagance. The cellarer could unlock the wine cask, but only briefly. The monks could enjoy the meal, but were to remain aware that all feasting is temporary. Some feast days even came during fasting seasons, like Lent or Advent. In those cases, the monks observed the feast spiritually rather than physically, reading longer passages, praying more deeply, and sometimes receiving slightly warmed meals in place of cold ones, a soft comfort, not a rich one. The idea was never to deny joy, but to redefine it. Joy, to a monk, was found in rhythm, in memory, in the texture of bread when it was freshly baked, in the glimmer of a second spoonful of honey, in the knowledge that today's meal carried meaning deeper than hunger. Some monasteries even maintained a calendar of anniversaries, the death dates of beloved abbots, founding days of the abbey, or moments when the community had been delivered from danger, like plague or famine. On these days, too, a meal might be modestly enriched. In the Abbey of Saint-Avit, in 14th century France, one chronicle describes how, on the anniversary of a flood that nearly destroyed the granary, the monks each received a handful of roasted chestnuts, a symbol of survival and gratitude. No speech marked the occasion, only the warm, earthy crunch shared in silence. Children in nearby villages would sometimes gather outside the monastery walls on feast evenings. They watched for smoke from the kitchen chimney, listening for the soft toll of bells. Some would even sneak up close, hoping for a glimpse through the cracks in the wooden gates. They knew that something was happening inside, not wild celebration, but sacred warmth. perhaps a second loaf of bread, perhaps a flicker of candlelight long after Vespers, and in the refectory the monks would eat slowly, their bowls a little fuller, their prayers a little longer, the reader's voice perhaps softer, more melodic, because feasting was not about indulgence, it was about remembering that life held joy, even in structure. That food could be more than sustenance. That time, when marked with care, became something sacred. Yet even as the feast came and went, the monks knew what followed. Tomorrow would return to bread and broth, to leeks and legumes, to quiet, unremarkable meals beneath vaulted ceilings. And perhaps that made the feast more precious, not because it was rare, but because it reminded them that joy was always near, even in the plainest bowl, that it was waiting quietly, beneath the lentils and beside the barley, which leads one to wonder, in a world so rich with taste and noise, could it be that the quietest feasts are the ones we remember longest? Evening falls again on the abbey. The bell sounds, not as a demand, but a reminder. Its tone is familiar, resonant, low. Across the cloisters, through the scriptorium, in the garden, and along the stone hallways, the monks begin to gather. The day's work is done. Their hands have held quills, scythes, brooms, and books. Now they are empty, save for the readiness to receive what has been prepared. Dinner is waiting. It is simple, and it always has been. Through centuries of change, war, pestilence, and reform, the monastic meal remained, a quiet, almost invisible act of faith, happening every evening in stone-walled rooms lit by small fires and small prayers. This daily rhythm, while boring to some, was sacred to others. It was the physical expression of stability, humility, and obedience, not just to God, but to order, to routine, and to the belief that something small, done daily, can shape the soul. In the height of medieval monasticism, thousands of abbeys across Europe shared in this practice. From the salt-swept cloisters of Lindisfarne to the dry stones of Monte Cassino, monks followed the same patterns. They gathered at the same hour, bowed their heads at the same prayers, and ate meals that changed only with the seasons or the liturgical year. They did not eat for pleasure. They ate for continuity, and yet, over time, something beautiful occurred. This quiet practice, measured, predictable, unremarkable, outlasted kings. It continued through wars and the fall of empires. When great cities burned or rose anew, monks still stirred lentils in wooden pots. When new inventions spread, paper, printing, gunpowder, the abbeys still baked bread by hand, still waited for barley to soften over coals. Their recipes were never written in cookbooks. Their meals were rarely mentioned in chronicles. But in the margins of ancient manuscripts, one can still find small notes in Latin. Pottage thin today, or cheese shared after vigils. These were the details they remembered, not the feast, but the habit. And perhaps, in this repetition, something was revealed. In an age when most people's meals depended on the yield of fickle fields, the monastery stood as a place of regularity, not abundance, not luxury, but enough. The monks ate the same food, day after day, season after season, and in doing so, they achieved what many in the outside world could not, a life not of survival, but of balance. Their dinners taught them patience. A bowl of peas, if eaten slowly, could become a meditation. A crust of bread, dipped in broth, could remind them of the body made whole. The small sound of chewing, the warmth of a shared table, the rhythm of spoon to bowl, each was part of a larger wordless liturgy. Some abbeys preserved records of the longest-serving kitchen monks. Brother Elfric of Glastonbury worked in the kitchen for 17 years, according to one chronicle, never once missing a dinner. His hands, it was said, were stained with onion and ash. He died one winter evening, quietly, after setting out bowls for the next day's meal. Others are remembered not by name, but by action. The monk who always offered his bread to the novice, the cellarer who wept when the bean harvest failed, the gardener who left apples on the reader's bench during the Feast of the Transfiguration. These stories were passed on not through stained glass or statues, but through repetition. A brother would learn to cook by watching the one before him. Recipes were taught not by measurement, but by memory. Meals became a language without words, a history without parchment. Even today, traces remain. In remote corners of France, Italy, England, and Spain, former abbeys, now museums or ruins, still house ancient kitchens. Their chimneys are blackened with soot centuries old. In the corners, one may find old bread, ovens carved into the wall, or iron hooks where pots once hung. The stones remain cold, but the memory is warm. In some modern monasteries, monks still follow similar rhythms. Dinner is still quiet, still prepared with care, still humble. And for visitors, those permitted to share a monastic meal, it is often a profound experience, not because the food is extraordinary, but because the silence around it is. No one rushes, no one boasts, no one speaks. Instead, you hear the sounds that have been heard for 1,000 years, the scrape of a bowl, the rustle of robes, the murmur of a prayer. And in that moment, you might feel something ancient awaken. Not awe exactly, but a quiet reverence. The realization that even the most boring parts of history, what someone ate for dinner, can tell you everything about who they were, what they valued, and what kind of world they were trying to build. Because dinner in a medieval abbey was never just about food. It was about devotion, about humility, about the patience to endure another day, another season, another Lent. It was about surviving, together. And as we reflect on those dinners, so modest, so often overlooked, we might ask, what small rituals in our own lives will be remembered? What daily gestures, repeated not for glory but for meaning, might one day whisper quietly across time? You might picture a Roman road as a grand arrow-straight line stretching into the mist, paved with flat stones, lined with columns, perhaps echoing with the steps of soldiers and the turning of chariot wheels. And you wouldn't be wrong. But the truth of Roman roads is far quieter, and perhaps even more impressive. Because what made Roman roads last was not just engineering. It was the daily effort of ordinary labourers, careful planning, and the accumulation of thousands of mundane decisions. What stone to use, how deep to dig, when to patch, and when to let the earth rest. Roman roads weren't designed to impress, they were designed to endure, and they began, almost always, with a hole. Somewhere near the edge of a Roman town, a team of surveyors, agrimensors, would walk slowly in silence. They carried long rods, measuring cords, waxed tablets. They stared. At hills, noted the lay of streams, marked the fall of shadows. The work was not glamorous. It required standing still for long hours, watching the land breathe. Once the path was chosen, the digging began. Roman roads were never just placed on the earth. They were sunk into it. Labourers, often slaves or hired locals, dug deep trenches, sometimes over 5 feet deep, removing soil layer by layer. The earth they removed would not go to waste. It was set aside to be repacked later as embankments or side shoulders. Into the trench, the first layer went down. Statumen, large stones, laid, roughly but firmly, like the bones of a skeleton. Above that came ruderatio, a layer of gravel or rubble, sometimes mixed with lime. This was pounded again and again, using wooden tampers, until it held firm like concrete. Then came the nucleus, a finer mixture of sand, clay, and crushed brick, pressed to form a cushion. And finally, the surface. Summum dorsum, large paving, stones, fitted so tightly together that centuries later, some would still hold their shape. Each layer was dull, heavy, uneventful, and yet together they formed one of the most resilient systems of infrastructure in human history. But Roman roads were more than structure. They were a promise that mail could travel from Antioch to Gaul, that merchants could move fish, wine, and olive oil in springtime, that soldiers could be summoned in winter, that governors could inspect their provinces without delay. Even the mile markers, the tall cylindrical stones set every 1,000 paces, were more than directional tools. They were symbols of presence, reminders that Rome watched, that the empire touched even the quietest valleys. Most roads weren't built in a year. Some took decades. Some were never quite finished, but used anyway. And the people who built them, maintained them, and walked them were not emperors or generals. They were ordinary Romans, roadkeepers, wheelwrights, contractors, and peasants who patched potholes between harvests. The roads were inspected regularly and notes were kept. Drainage. Poor between mile 42 and 44. Pavement cracked near the bridge. Stone missing on west shoulder. Sometimes, a road inspector, a curator viarum, might travel with a mule cart and chalk, marking problems in the stone for repair crews to find later. These men were often retired soldiers, chosen not for wealth, but for endurance. They knew how to walk and how to wait. In colder regions, road upkeep was nearly constant. Snow had to be shoveled, floods diverted, moss scraped from stones before it could become dangerous. In warmer climates, sun baked the roadbed until cracks formed. These too had to be filled, usually with a mixture of sand and broken tile pressed in by hand. No single act kept the roads intact. It was the layering of care, small efforts repeated, just like the roads themselves. Travel on these roads was never smooth. Despite the image of polished marble highways, most Roman roads were bumpy, slippery, and noisy. Carts rattled, wheels caught in grooves, horses stumbled, but they remained usable. A cart could travel 50 miles in a day. A letter could reach the capital in a fortnight. A messenger on horseback could change the fate of a province. And all of this was possible, not because the roads were perfect, but because they were resilient, and so the roads lasted. Some fell into disrepair after the fall of the empire. Others were simply buried, overgrown by vines and forgotten. But in surprising places, the roads remained. In parts of Italy, you can still walk along ancient stretches of Via Appia, the stones worn smooth by centuries of sandals and hooves. In England, portions of Ermine Street and Watling Street form the basis of modern highways. Even today, when engineers excavate for new roads or train tracks, they often encounter Roman layers beneath the soil. A foundation of statumen laid 2,000 years ago, still bearing weight. And as we reflect on those ancient roads, so carefully built, so often walked, it becomes clear that their strength wasn't in the stone alone. It was in the patience, the belief that effort, no matter how small or boring, could carry a civilization across continents. That even the simplest task, laying, gravel, tamping clay, setting stone, was worth doing well, because someone would walk it tomorrow. And so, you might ask, what are we building today that will carry others far beyond our time? And the early hours of the morning, before sunrise warmed, the eastern sky, the Roman road was already awake. A cart might creak softly in the distance, its wooden wheels uneven against the stone. The driver, cloaked and quiet, would have begun his journey well before dawn, steering by feel as much as sight. He might be hauling amphorae of olive oil, or bolts of wool, or sometimes simply grain. These carts moved not for glory, but for necessity. Every town needed food, every villa required fuel, every legion demanded salt, and so the road, even before it filled with footsteps, bore the weight of need. Along the side of the road, small milestones stood like silent watchers. Each marked a distance, typically 1,000 double paces from the center of the last major city. Their inscriptions changed from place to place. Some listed the names of emperors, others the officials responsible for the repairs, and a few bore simple phrases like Via quieta est. The road is calm. These stones, though seemingly plain, served a bureaucratic purpose. If a section of the road fell into disrepair, the milestones made it easy to locate the problem. A letter from a military officer might say, "Flood damage 2 miles beyond Mile Extoire," or "Bandit sightings near the bridge south of Mile Danks." Roman roads were not just tools of movement, they were networks of administration. Every road had someone responsible for it. The role changed hands, but it was never ceremonial. The curator viarum, often a man of middle status, had to balance costs, weather reports, and the behavior of travelers. He answered to the Senate, or the emperor, himself. In one surviving inscription from Hispania, a curator named Marcus Lucilius lists the exact budget for a 14-mile stretch of road: labor, materials, mule teams, and stonecutters. He also notes in a weary final line, "Unseasonal rains added 11 days to completion." It is one of the most boring lines in Roman epigraphy, and yet, it tells a quiet truth about how roads were made to last. Through persistence, not perfection. Along the road, way stations, known as mutationes and mansiones, provided shelter, food, and new animals for travelers. These were often spaced every 20 to 30 kilometers. The distance a horse could reasonably travel in a day before needing rest. They weren't luxurious. Most were little more than stone buildings with thatched roofs, sometimes surrounded by walls to keep out wolves or thieves. Inside, the daily routine was the same. The stabularius, stable-keeper, rose early to check the hooves of the mules. The cook stirred porridge from leftover grain. An apprentice swept the floors. A scribe, if the post was important enough, might record the travelers who passed through. 3 soldiers, 2 merchants, a woman with a sick child. These records were kept on wax tablets and stored in drawers beside the hearth. Few of them survive, but when they do, they speak volumes, not about famous travelers, but about the normal flow of life, the unnoticed traffic of people crossing the empire. A woman from southern Gaul travelled to visit her cousin in Narbo. A potter brought his wares to the spring market. A soldier transferred from one outpost to another, never to return. Each left a trace, and in time, each trace added to the grooves worn deep into the paving stones. Some Roman roads, even today, show visible ruts, carved by the repeated passage of carts. These ruts aren't design flaws, they're proof of use. The average Roman cart had a wheelbase of about 4 feet 8 inches, roughly the same as today's standard railway gauge, not by coincidence, but by tradition. These grooves became self-reinforcing. Wheels that didn't fit would break, or wobble, or fall into the ditch. So wheelwrights adjusted their carts to fit the roads. Roads that had been built to fit carts began shaping carts in return. It was a feedback loop of design, accidental but effective. Roads began to define how people moved, and over time, even how they thought about distance. A journey wasn't measured in kilometers or miles, but in days of travel. From Rome to Capua, 5 days on foot. From Massilia to Arles, 2 days by cart if the weather held. And travelers didn't think in terms of north or south, but in terms of which road: the Via Aurelia, the Via Flaminia, the Via Ignatia. The road wasn't just the path, it was the destination. Beside the roads, small shrines began to appear. They were not grand temples, but humble altars, stones dedicated to Mercury, the god of travel, or to local spirits believed to protect wanderers. Some were maintained by families who lived nearby. Others were erected by travelers in thanks for surviving a long journey.